Well, here we're our speaker today. We've been Sarah Ziomek is the sustainability manager there at this little DFW airport. And as I say, it's when I first heard about it, it was like the size of Manhattan Island. There's a lot of territory and land there. And so I was interested. She said sustainability. I want to know how they're sustaining the land and the property, as well as the airport is a leader in sustainability, but we're talking about the buildings basically. But she had went to TCU and interned at Britt here and is into plants and nature. So she's happy to let us know a little bit about it. And also I mentioned to talk about saving the birds that we're worried about. We always hear about in New York City, the geese and stuff sinking, crashing airplanes. So she's going to fill us all in on the airport and that big piece of land up there.
Okay, yes, tonight I'm here to talk to you a little bit about biodiversity at DFW Airport. And I was really excited when Jim asked me to speak because usually I'm talking about either emissions reductions or energy or waste or a variety of different aspects of sustainability. And very rarely do people ask me to talk about plants. Well, they never ask me to talk about plants, but that is what my background is in. So I'm Sarah Ziomek. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager at DFW International Airport. And I'm in the Environmental Affairs Department. And I figured I'd start by giving you a little background on myself. I grew up spending summers on my grandparents' farm in Indiana, and that's where I grew to love being outdoors and love nature. So I had a very early interest in science, and I knew I wanted to study science when I went to college. So I went to TCU for both my undergrad and my master's. I studied environmental science, and I did my master's thesis research. I worked and I was an intern at the Botanic Research Institute of Texas next door, and I studied plant diversity of LBJ National Grassland Ponds. So back then I could identify hundreds of native plants. It's kind of like a language. You don't use it, you lose it. So I'm not as good at plant identification as I used to be, but that was really my start into the environmental world, was focusing on plants and specifically wetland plants. I studied abroad in the Galapagos Islands, really just was very interested in ecology. Graduated from TCU, worked for the National Park Service for a little bit. And then I started working in consulting as an environmental scientist and a wetland scientist. So I did lots of field work throughout Texas and some other states. And then eventually about 5.5 years ago, I ended up at DFW Airport, started as an environmental analyst, and then moved over into the sustainability team. So that's where I'm at now. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background on DFW Airport. Since you're local, you probably know a little bit about it or have driven through there or flown through there. But it's a very large campus. It's more than 17,000 acres, almost 27 square miles. It's larger than Manhattan. We have an employee population of about 2,000 people, but there's over 60,000 people that come and work at the airport every day. And so we really operate kind of like a city. We have our own police and fire department. We have our own post office, and the airport is very forward-thinking in sustainability and environmental management. So we're the first carbon neutral airport in North America, and we have a lot of other goals, some of which I'll kind of cover tonight, biodiversity being one of those. And DFW Airport opened in 1974, and back then, if you were in this area, it was pretty much just kind of open land in between Fort Worth, in between Dallas, in between the two city centers. And now today we're the second busiest airport in the world, 5 terminals, 7 runways. There's lots of non-aeronautical development around the airport. So warehouses, lots of businesses have chosen to locate there since it's a great spot to be with connectivity all over the world. So it's a very growing campus, but as we grow, we're seeking to do so sustainably and thinking about the future and making sure we're preserving our natural resources for future generations. And so the way we think about it, the role of an airport has changed over time. DFW used to be very reactive when it came to environmental management. If you think about like spills or pollution, but through a history of kind of some unfortunate incidents, over time, DFW became more proactive and started thinking about how can we not only, follow environmental regulations, but actually go above and beyond what the law requires to be better stewards of our environment. And so now the mission of my department, Environmental Affairs, is to protect people and to protect the environment. And so I manage the sustainability program specifically, and we have several different focus areas. Climate action, that's our net zero goal, focus on decarbonizing, energy performance, using energy more wisely. Circular economy is focused on waste reduction, water and biodiversity, and then equity and health and wellness. So also focusing on the people side, not just the environment. But water and biodiversity is what we'll focus on tonight. And we're in the midst of updating our sustainability management plan. And so this is kind of just a snippet from it. It's still draft form, but I figured I'd show it. So for each of our sustainability focus areas, we're developing a roadmap with different key goals and initiatives we want to implement. And so for water and biodiversity, we're thinking about water conservation and water use, and then also water quality and watershed management, which really ties in with plants, because the better you maintain your riparian areas and the more native plants you have, the better your water quality. Tree conservation, and then resilient regenerative ecosystems and biodiversity protection. So first I'll talk a little bit about our tree conservation plan. And tonight I have a bunch of slides and I'm probably going to go through a lot of them quickly. So I wanted to just kind of cover a lot, and I think I emailed a PDF of my presentation. So some of them are kind of for a leave behind. If you want more information, you'll have them for reference later. And when I started working at DFW Airport, one thing that kind of shocked me is how much construction we have, and how many trees we are losing. Because if you remember the photo I showed kind of at the beginning, you can see that outside of the airfield, there's a lot of natural land area, a lot of tree cover, but trees were being cleared very rapidly. And having worked as an environmental consultant, I knew that all of the cities in our Metroplex and really across the state have some sort of tree preservation ordinance or stipulation, but yet the airport had none. So our team started really just looking into some of the trends we were seeing. We looked at statewide trends, saw that, everything's bigger in Texas. Texas is one of the leading states in the nation for loss in tree cover and for replacing that with impervious cover with concrete and buildings. So then we wanted to look at DFW in particular and see, could the observations we are noticing on the ground, how could we look at that from a data perspective? And so we used GIS and some mapping tools to quantify the tree cover, and we found that we had 23% canopy cover across the airport. I think this was back in 2019 when we did our baseline. So that's pretty impressive. A quarter of the airport is covered by tree canopy. And the heaviest part of that is on the western side. That's where the Bear Creek runs. So it's a nice floodplain area, but there's trees spread throughout. And one thing that was, really tugged at our heartstrings in the environmental department is that we saw with all of these different commercial developments across the airport, we were losing a lot of different trees. And so I've kind of shown them in the aerial where we built large warehouses and they just kind of cleared out all of the trees. And so we wanted to think about how could we still enable development, which is an important part of the airport's business model, but also just do so more mindfully and think about how can we preserve trees while at the same time enabling the airport to grow and meet the needs of our region. So we looked at tree cover across the airport, and the green is the forested areas, and we mapped it out against our land use plan. So we know where future like commercial and industrial development is planned for. So we started looking at where that was, and we began developing the business case for a tree conservation plan. And so what we did was we talked with a lot of different departments and with our executives about the benefits and the value of urban trees. And we introduced the concept of ecosystem services, where all of the services and functions that our natural ecosystems provide aren't really able to be quantified financially, at least not very easily. So they're really not given weight in policy decisions. And so that's something that we wanted to train. So we kind of wanted to start talking about all of the benefits that trees and our ecosystems provide, and assign somewhat of a financial value to some of those services if we could, to help make the business case for saving trees. And I put the EONS up here. EONS is the framework we use when making sustainability decisions. It's an acronym that stands for economic viability, operational efficiency, natural resource conservation, and social responsibility. So that's kind of our internal framework, where as we're developing our business case and communicating our solutions, we're trying to address those 4 different areas. And so we really just began talking about all the different ecosystem services that our trees provide. These are some of the ones we talked about, and I'll call out a few highlights. And one is temperature regulation and helping mitigate the urban heat island effect. The city of Dallas did a study several years ago, and they looked at the urban heat island effect, where you have these urban areas and all of this pavement and these buildings that just absorb and radiate heat. But if you look at areas that are covered with trees or more natural landscaping, those are much cooler. So in the urban areas, you get these heat islands where the city center is, easily 10 degrees warmer than surrounding suburbs and more rural areas. And so we took out an infrared camera, and we wanted to take temperature readings across the airport. So on the left side, we measured a road inside or within the shade and outside of the shade. And on the other side, we measured ETAN, that's one of our buildings, the building surface in the sun and in the shade. And there were 40 degree temp differences in the surface temperature, I think, which was shocking for a lot of people at the airport, especially when we think about even just utility bills of, if you have buildings and infrastructure that's that hot, that's costly, and then it leads to increased maintenance. Your roads are require a lot more maintenance when they're exposed to that much heat. We also looked at air quality, since our region is in non-attainment for federal ozone standards. We looked at using a tool online, the iTree tool set. It was developed by the U.S. Forest Service, and it helps you map out and kind of estimate and quantify the air pollutant removal that trees provide. And it also estimates and gives you an estimate of dollar value. So we found that we're looking at ozone because that's particularly of concern in our region, but our trees provide $90 million worth of air pollutant removal services. So again, that's not something that can be really quantified on our balance sheet, but it's something to keep in mind, is that there is this intrinsic value. We also talked about stormwater management, and the photo on the right is a waterfall that's actually at DFW Airport. It's on the southwest side of the airport. Not many people know it exists, not many employees. But it's this beautiful waterfall, and there's this beautiful stream along Bear Creek. And we know that preserving the trees on that riparian corridor is really critical to maintaining the health of this really beautiful ecosystem. Let's see. And then we also talked about noise. Aircraft noise is definitely an environmental concern for our community. And we researched several interesting studies and saw that trees can provide a barrier that does reduce noise physically, but then they're also more of a mental barrier, where they reduce the perception of noise. So if you can't see an airplane, or you can't see the traffic because there's trees screening it, that lowers your perception of noise as well. And then we also talked more about the cultural and social services that trees provide, and how they're really important to just human health and that access to green space. So our customers want to see green space, our employees do. And so that's something that's really critical. We did research on all the local cities that have urban forestry regulations. We looked at all their ordinances. We paid close attention to the cities of Fort Worth and Dallas, since they're our owner cities, and kind of modeled our regulations after theirs. And we developed a few different objectives for our tree conservation plan. We wanted to establish and communicate what DFW's approach to tree conservation would be. We wanted to provide guidelines for all of the different development and projects that occur across the airport. And then we also wanted to align with our sustainability plan and our strategic plan, which promote sustainability and environmental conservation. And so the goal we have, which is pretty lofty, is to achieve no net loss of tree canopy cover. So ideally, as some trees are lost inevitably for development, they're going to be replaced, and maybe there's a loss in the near term, but as those trees grow and mature, we're maintaining the same canopy cover across the airport. And so we developed requirements for each different construction project that occurs across the airport to follow a set of different processes. They have to do a tree survey, provide a report to us detailing all the species of trees, their canopy cover, their diameter. They have to establish their preservation requirement and develop a plan sheet that shows what they're going to preserve, what they're going to remove, and then what new trees they're going to plant. And then there's requirements during construction to make sure the trees you say you're preserving are actually going to get saved and not run over by a bulldozer or have their roots annihilated. And then a post-construction review. We want to make sure that the trees they actually plant and are getting credit for stay alive, that they're watering them and providing the care needed. So we established different tree protection measures. This is pretty common to a lot of cities around here where you have protective fencing, you have different protective measures for what's called the critical root zone of the trees. So all the trees that you're preserving are protected during construction. We did establish a few areas that are exempt from these requirements. The airfield, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, that's heavily regulated, especially by the FAA. There's not trees in the airfield. So utility right-of-ways, emergency, disease trees, hazardous ones, those are exempt. But other than that, especially on the land, what we call the land side of the airport, if they're doing construction, they have to follow the tree conservation plan. And it wasn't an overnight implementation. We went through a period of several years where some projects were grandfathered in and there was a slow, soft rollout because this was such a mind shift and a concept change for a lot of the different projects and developments. But the short highlights are that each different project has to preserve a minimum of 25% of the diameter inches of trees. And then for the different land uses, they have a different factor of the not of the canopy, but of the inches of tree diameter, what they have to achieve post-construction. And so they can do that through preserving and through planting. And when they're planting, they get higher credit for large trees versus small trees. So we want to incentivize them to plant large trees. And so the idea is that through preservation and through planting, and there's some math and spreadsheets involved, they're going to be replacing what was lost. So they're replacing the diameter inches, and then the goal is ultimately that translates back into canopy cover once these trees mature. So that's the tree conservation plan. And now I wanted to share a little bit about a different project, which was our biodiversity study. And also, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I know I'm kind of flying through a bunch of different topics here. So if you have a question on something, don't hesitate to stop me. And this is another picture of our waterfall. This was taken in April. So
where is that waterfall?
it's kind of on the southwest side of the airport. It's along Bear Creek. So, but it's kind of hard you can't see it from a road or from really any public area. It's kind of buried in there, but it was found several years ago by employees from our department, just kind of out wandering the woods and I think doing some water quality studies. It probably doesn't look that pretty right now. It's probably bone dry, but in the spring, it's really flowing. So our biodiversity assessment was a project related to the biodiversity focus area of our sustainability plan. And for all of our other different sustainability focus areas like energy, it's really easy to come up with a metric or a key performance area indicator to measure success. But for biodiversity, that's a lot harder to measure, at least at an airport scale. And so we really were trying to think, how can we find a measurement where we can track change over time and do this repeatedly? And so we worked with a consultant and developed this biodiversity metric that is based off of something that was developed internationally. So the goal of the project was to look at what different habitat types are found at DFW, what size they are, how do they connect, find a way where we could map and monitor our 17,000 acres of land throughout the future where it wouldn't be so burdensome. Because as much as, I'd like to go out and do plant surveys, I don't have the time or capacity to monitor 17,000 acres year after year. That's just not going to happen. So we wanted to find some way of using digital tools combined with time on the ground and in the field to find a way where we could track changes in land use. And normally on my slides, I go for more pictures. I have a lot of text here. Again, it's kind of a leave behind, and I wanted to just kind of share a lot of the findings from the study. So here we have a lot of text. I'm not expecting you to read it all as I talk. But the first step of this was to do a remote sensing analysis. And so remote sensing uses a lot of GIS data, satellite data, and computer modeling to look at aerial imagery, LiDAR data of the region, and start in the computer mapping out and classifying the different land cover types. So we used more recent aerial imagery, and then we worked with a consultant who developed this really interesting modeling approach where they took input data. So they took from Texas Parks and Wildlife. TPWD has a Texas Ecological Mapping Systems data set. The name is something similar to that. I may not have it just right, but they took data where you have known classifications of your land, and then they developed a model that could start learning how to identify that in aerial imagery. So they started training it with data that they knew the answers, and then they started uploading input data, some more recent aerials, more recent LiDAR data, and developing a model that could, on the computer, predict the different land cover types across the airport. But of course, the computer isn't going to predict perfectly. So you can look at the color values, you can look at elevation data and LiDAR and see what's, a tree, what's grassland, but it's still not going to be perfect. So teams were sent out to do ground truthing. And so first they did a desktop evaluation of what the reference plant community should be. So they looked at Texas Parks and Wildlife data, NatureServe, the NRCS, I think soil surveys have like a plant list, national wetland inventory. So they used all this published data as the starting point. And then they went out and did an on-site condition assessment. So they looked at the different habitat types and developed this score sheet to measure species richness, how healthy the ecosystem was in person. And then took photographs because we want to have a record through time. Forgot all of these were animated. And so the biodiversity metric was the next piece of this. And there's something called the Natural England Biodiversity Metric. And it was a system designed in England to really standardize the quantification of biodiversity. So in short, what that means is coming up with a number to measure the biodiversity of a specific land area. And so we took that international metric and kind of adapted it for use at DFW, but it's still based off of the same underlying factors where that score for your land area is based off of the habitat type, the size of it, how distinct and unique that area is, the condition and the health of it, and then any strategic significance for conservation because of its uniqueness. So it calculates biodiversity as a unit score. And that score is what we plan to use to track change over time. So condition, again, kind of same thing I just mentioned, but condition, you're assigning a numeric score for how healthy the habitat in that ecosystem is. And so we had a team that conducted field work over, I think, 2 weeks, and they used this detailed field assessment form. And I know it's probably hard to read, but in short, they basically just collected a lot of data. It says, what was the habitat type identified by remote monitoring, by that computer survey? Is that what you actually observed in the field? And if not, select the correct habitat. And then a lot more questions, what's the age distribution of trees? Is there feral hog damage? Are there invasive plant species? How many native tree species? What's the cover of native tree species? So a lot of different data was collected on research points throughout the airport. Plants, percent cover, what are the most dominant plant species or graminoid species? And so all this data was collected. And basically what we did is we took the Texas Parks and Wildlife data, which has very detailed map types for land cover across the state. And we simplified that into these broader habitat categories. And personally, I love the detail of the Texas Parks and Wildlife data, but when we're using computers to aid us in our habitat classification efforts in the future, just because 17,000 acres is big, this is really kind of the resolution, the habitat category that the computer can help us get to. So on a computer, when you're using remote sensing and the monitoring, the computer can't tell the difference between East Central Texas plains, post oak savanna and woodland, and cross timbers oak forest. It just can't get that detailed. So what we call that is mixed mosaic woodland. So we came up with these, I think, 7 habitat categories across the airport. So managed grassland, that covers a lot of the airfield where the grass is kept really short. Blackland prairie, we have some native and introduced tallgrass species dominated systems. We have a lot of floodplain and riparian forests, particularly on the west side of the airport along Bear Creek, the major stream. We have mixed mosaic forests, open water. We do have some swamps and wetlands. There's a pretty large land area that was termed native invasive, where you have native species that are aggressive to an area. So a lot of areas with dense privet stands, and then urban high intensity, that would be the areas that are paved, like our airfield, all the streets, the buildings, all of those built up areas. And so here's just an example of some of the data that was used during the field assessment. I think this is the plant list from the NRCS soil survey, I believe, showing what would be expected in a specific area, and then kind of some examples of what was found. So the teams out in the field took example photos for each of these different habitat categories of high quality and low quality systems. So here on the left, you have high quality blackland prairie with a lot of warm season grasses. And then on the right side, you have blackland prairie that's lower quality with native or with more invasive species. And so as the team went out, they're looking at these different habitat types and saying, okay, what's the condition and how are we going to assign a scale and a value to that? Here's just another example. A lot of different information was captured for future reference on what the reference vegetation community should be, on-site conditions, tree cover, what the woody canopy should be versus what it actually was. So just a lot of qualitative narrative data was collected too. And then for each different habitat category, we had a list of ways we could uplift or restore the site. So basically, if the site in that habitat area wasn't really healthy and was in a poor quality condition, what could be done to improve it? So controlling invasive species in the blackland prairie areas is definitely one of the #1 things we could do. We could rewild with more native, desirable tallgrass species. We could do a lot more preservation to keep these areas connected rather than just isolated. Could add more organic matter to the soil, discourage brush encroachment, a lot of common land management techniques. But we really wanted to have a list for each different type of habitat. What can we do better? So these are things that we're going to think about implementing in the future, not necessarily doing all of these now, but definitely as we mature and get better at land management, things to think about improving. So a few different photos, cross timbers, forest and woodland. We have a lot of high quality and then some low quality too. It just kind of depends on where you're at the airport, if it was an area that was historically disturbed. So throughout the history of the airport, there's been a lot of different buildings and land management practices. So you get some areas that haven't been touched for decades, and then some that obviously have evidence of human use. Native invasive, this is an example of what those look like. This covers a lot of our heavily disturbed areas or the edges kind of more natural undisturbed areas. Southeastern Great Plains floodplain forest. We have areas with a lot of bank erosion. As you can imagine, with all of the paved surfaces at the airport, there's a lot of stormwater runoff. So there's definitely something we're working to mitigate. We have a great team that works on green stormwater infrastructure, but there's definitely areas that have a lot of erosion. And then, so this is just an example of what the remote sensing results look like on a map. And so here we actually have a web page where different airport users can go look at the results of this baseline biodiversity assessment and see what it was mapped to. So if they're considering a development in a particular area, they can look at what's there currently. And then finally, we took all of that extensive data we collected. So we have the habitat category, we have the area, the distinctiveness, and then the condition, which was assessed in the field. And all of those different parameters got assigned a numeric score, and that gives you habitat units. So you're basically multiplying the area by the score in these different areas, and you get on the right side your habitat units. So the total habitat units we had was about 20,000. So basically that's that quantitative number that we can use to track change over time, because in 5 years and 10 years, we could go back out to these same reference points and we could monitor, has the condition changed? Have we, completely bulldozed an area? Now the condition is, it's completely built up. It's not healthy, or have we restored an area and has the condition improved? So now we can start tracking change over time. And again, yes, it's reproducible. That was our goal in this, is as much as it would be great to do extensive field work all the time, we just don't have the capacity for that. There's a lot of other environmental obligations we have. So yes, I'd love field work, but we're looking for something that we can use, limited field work, and then computer tools and GIS to measure these changes. And so here's just one example of adaptive management or ecosystem restoration. You could take an open water swamp area, and by improving the water quality, improving the presence of native plant species, removing invasive species, providing bank stabilization, you could increase that condition score, and then that increases your habitat unit score. So that's something that eventually we'd like to roll out to different projects across the airport. Yes, we could track it at an airport scale, but it would be really interesting if for specific projects or developments or tenants, if we tracked the way they manage their land too.
I have a question.
Sure.
What is a good biometric score?
I guess it really depends. And that's why it's hard to just say what's a good score. It's relative. So this was our baseline. Is 20,000 units good? I don't know. But the intent is that was our baseline. And so we're going to track how it changes. So I don't know if there is a good score, because the score is influenced by your land area. So the larger your land area, the higher the score. It's more to track change up and down from a baseline.
The numbers can be the goal.
Yes, exactly. The goal would be for the number to grow rather than shrink. And so the last thing I was going to talk about is wildlife at DFW. And I will preface this with, we have an on-site wildlife biologist, a wildlife manager, and she is a fantastic speaker. And so this is her specialty. I'm speaking about what I've heard from her and what I've learned from her. So wildlife management isn't my specialty, but I'm happy to share what I've learned from her and what I know about how we take care of it at DFW Airport. And the first piece is that the FAA has a lot of restrictions and a lot of guidance on preventing wildlife hazards to aviation and to aircraft, especially birds. Birds are the #1 wildlife hazard. So we want to protect people on the planes, and we also don't want the birds to get injured or killed hitting a plane. And so FAA issues these documents called advisory circulars, where they basically provide guidance and kind of elaborate further on the regulations. And so this particular advisory circular is dedicated to hazardous wildlife attractants. And so I won't go into the details, but it lists a lot of specific steps that they want you to take, or they suggest you take. Like some of the recommendations we've incorporated are that no standing water is allowed on the airfield, because that would potentially attract waterfowl. We do have a lake on the airport, though. It's a pretty large lake, but it's off the airfield. We have wetlands at the airport, but they're off the airfield. So on the airfield, no standing water, grass is kept mowed to 6 inches. And then FAA also prefers that you don't have grass species with a large seed head because they think those are going to be a higher wildlife attractant. And so they think there's a lot of conjecture on what plant species might or might not be the biggest wildlife attractant. So DFW did some research on that. And first I wanted to kind of show these graphs from a news article back in, I think, 2015 or so, and it was on wildlife strikes reported from DFW Airport. And it's voluntary to report strikes. So I think DFW does really good at reporting them, but it is voluntary. So there could be some strikes that go unreported just because pilots aren't mandated to. But looking at the data we do have from what's reported, mourning doves were the top type of wildlife struck by aircraft in 2022. I said this was from a 2015 or 16 article, obviously not. I think I'm thinking of a different one. So this is a more recent article. And so what DFW did, this is Kathy Boyles on the left. She's our wildlife administrator. She actually worked with the Botanical Research Institute of Texas with Amanda Neal, one of the botanists, to look at these birds that were being struck by aircraft. I think this was a mourning dove, and they went through a process where all of the birds that were struck, they collected them and they did unzipping, where they basically cut them open and they looked at what was inside and looked at the plant seeds that were there. And they worked with the botanist, Amanda Neal, to identify these seeds and identify plant species of concern. So you guys can come look at these afterwards, volume for spring, fall, winter, and summer. And this is a field guide to the plants of DFW Airport with a special focus on wildlife attractants. So this is more focused on the airfield, so not everything outside of the airfield, or not everything on the land side in the public areas, but it really lists plants of moderate concern, plants of high concern, plants of low concern, just based off of what was found inside the birds and what they had consumed. And I believe for the mourning doves, the #1 plant found inside them was P, which, if I remember correctly, is an introduced species.
What is it?
P, trying to think of the Latin name, P. It's a little purple flower. I should have brought a picture of it. Yeah, I think it's a non-native. It's in one of here, so I can show you afterwards. But I thought this was a really interesting and innovative way to use knowledge of botany and of plants to identify what we could do to better mitigate wildlife hazards. So based off of what they found during this study within the airfield, I think they started targeting certain plant species of concern, like this P with herbicides. So again, for wildlife management, the airfield is where we're most heavily regulated and where there's a lot more specific guidance from the FAA, but outside of it, we do have a little more leeway.
So was there like an ideal grass to plant around the one runways?
There's not a specific grass that they say, yes, this is perfect and safe. What historically has been the grass that was always planted was Bermuda grass, and which is not the greatest, but Bermuda grass has been what was used historically, both on the airfield and in all of our public areas. And so a few years ago, we worked to update our own internal airport specification and requirements on grasses that could be seeded or placed as sod on the airport, because in the past, I think our own internal airport regulations, so not from the FAA, but just our internal, I believe it mandated Bermuda grass. It may have had a couple others, but it was pretty strict. There weren't native plant species on there. So we worked with Texas A&M, we worked with our wildlife administrator, and we worked to select a few native plant species that could be used on the airport. Still not a big list because we had to come to a happy medium on ones that had small seed heads. So I think buffalo grass and blue grama were the ones that are recommended. But I was telling Jim before we met, just because we tell our construction contractors, yes, these grasses are allowed, doesn't mean that's what they're planting. And what we've seen since we made this change a couple of years ago is that our construction contractors either aren't familiar with native species, don't know where to get them, don't really know how to establish them because they haven't worked with them before. So while we've expanded the regulations in terms of what types of grass species are allowed, we haven't really seen construction contractors move that way. So that's definitely an area we could improve on.
And again, if you're doing it around the runways and you don't want to attract birds, Bermuda grass is perfect.
It is. And so yes, I think Bermuda grass is pretty much the only thing that gets planted out there, particularly because on the airfield, there's, you aren't allowed to seed. You have to place sod because they don't want bare ground. What they've seen is bare ground is more of a bird attractant than anything. If you have bare dirt, I guess they flock there. So the number one concern is to get vegetation established quickly. So on the airfield, it's only sod allowed. So Bermuda grass sod is what's readily available and that's what's used.
Then you start seeing different species, like if it's all Bermuda grass, then your birds trying to be grass.
Yes, yeah, right,
Bird,
yes.
that's the ones you see in bird life.
Yeah, exactly. So, which is really interesting. And what I've kind of wondered from this study, are the birds eating some of these plants because they prefer them? Or is that because that's what was available? So it's really interesting, the different preconceptions we have of what's going to attract wildlife. I mentioned that we have a lake and it's kind of just south of some of our runways. And we don't have a problem with ducks on the airfield. So you never know, I guess, is the lesson. But I thought this was a really interesting study. And then to your point, Michelle, like if you're out on the airfield by the runways, even if Bermuda grass is what was planted, that's not really what ends up being there over time. So there's definitely more diversity there. But
I can imagine this, you know, if you're looking at what was there in the soil.
yes,
And you're not. For
exactly.
What about butterflies, bees, and outside there?
Yes, we see a lot. So there's just anecdotally speaking, we haven't done any surveys, but we know we are in a monarch migration corridor. So it's something we've talked about is a lot of the more grassland areas have a lot of milkweed. So I know there's different monarch way station designations. It's something we've talked about maybe focusing a little more on, but hasn't been a project to date yet. And then bees, several airports have apiaries have bees. We don't yet, but that's something we want to do.
You want to take some questions from?
Sure.
So you have a recommended tree list you can share and you actively promote native species.
We do. So I could follow up with the recommended tree list. I think it's on our website, but it'd be hard to find. So I can definitely follow up with that. It includes a lot of native species. It does include some common, I can't think of the term, but landscaping ornamental species too. Some native species, this is again goes back to working with our wildlife biologists. The ones that produce large seeds are the ones that they're trying to stay away from. So it's kind of finding a balance between, yes, we want natives and we still want to mitigate wildlife attractants. So there is a list.
Someone else asked if you're improving the habitats around the airport and inside the airport, does not make it more desirable for wildlife. It could impede airplane traffic and safety and so.
Yes, so definitely the airfield is heavily closely watched. There's a wildlife hazard management plan. So there's a lot of different proactive measures they take on the airfield and then in the runway protection zone. So those are the areas where we're not doing a whole lot of different ecosystem restoration by any chance. That's where it's pretty much just Bermuda grass. But outside of the airfield, outside of the different protected airspace areas, that's where there's already been native vegetation there. So that's what we're trying to protect.
And is any airport land, particularly on the west side, protected from development?
Officially, no, but a lot of it is in the 100-year floodplain. So there's a lot of just federal regulations and state about development in the floodplain. So it's protected in that way, but that is something we've talked about. Is there a mechanism going forward to protect this through some sort of other mechanism? Okay,
Probably,
sure.
one thing, kind of an answer for you about protection plan that's set over the airport is there usually regulations of private buildings.
Mhm.
Because the planes taking off the landing. So, in a sense, some protection, they can't be building skyscrapers in line with the air runways. They're not going to get that approved.
Yeah. That's true. And then we also do have on the north side of the airport, there's a wetland area. And I think that was mitigation for a Corps of Engineers, Waters of the US permit. So there's other different mechanisms for requiring preservation, especially when it comes to areas around water bodies.
Yeah, there is one more
Sure.
from the chat. I didn't realize you did that. Okay, can you briefly talk about some of the other environmental obligations that your department has?
Sure. So we are, oh yes, so the question was about the different environmental obligations our department has. We have several different program areas. So I cover sustainability as well as air quality. So we have for example, an air quality permit for our central plant. And a lot of monitoring that we do since our region doesn't meet federal ozone standards. There's a lot of other regulatory requirements. We have a whole team dedicated to water resources. So they manage our stormwater plan. They do, for example, inspections of all of our different outfalls and our watersheds to measure water quality. They have a dam safety program in our lake. Stormwater protection is a big focus for them. We have a whole group dedicated to design and construction and for specifically focused on inside the buildings, asbestos remediation and mold, but also construction stormwater management, thinking about like sediment transfer outside of a site. We have a group focused on hazardous waste and remediation. So historically at an airport, as you can imagine, different industrial areas, you do have fuel spills, you have other just different chemicals from those industrial areas and aircraft maintenance. So remediation of contaminated soil and groundwater. Yeah, I think there's a few others, but those are just some of them. Basically air, land, water, waste. There's kind of a group dedicated to that. So we're really fortunate in that a lot of airports just have, a handful of people who do everything. And we have a department of, I think, close to 40 people. So there's definitely a big focus on protecting the environment.
We have time for one more question, Gordon, or we have? Okay, so last question, what drives the airport's ecological projects? You are setting a very high bar and I applaud you for it, but what will it take for the attitude to spread?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think it takes a lot of committed staff. So DFW Airport has been really a big proponent of sustainability for several decades, thanks to the vision of some of our leadership. But I think what catapulted the airport more into the spotlight was achieving carbon neutrality, because that got the airport recognized in the US, but also globally. And so I think having that spotlight put on us created an expectation that we would continue advancing and continue making progress in protecting the environment. So there's that aspect, but then there's just a lot of staff members that really love what they do. And there's competing priorities at the airport, as there are in any city or in any business. So it's always a balancing approach where we're constantly talking to stakeholders, and maybe both sides aren't quite happy, but there's still progress being made. Thank you.